again, everyone, thanks again for joining us. In this section, we're going to talk about the setup and configuration of DranXperT. We mentioned previously that DranXperT's user interface is a web browser. So you set up, you configure the instrument using a web browser. All the data is recorded locally to the meter, but you do use a web browser, just like an FTP site, to copy the data off and put it on your computer for further analysis by DranView XP, which again is free and included as a free download with DranXperT, but also by the more advanced DranView Pro and DranView Enterprise versions. So this is a web-enabled user interface. In previous sections, we covered about how to connect to DranXperT, how to set up an IP address to establish that connection between your computer, your device, and DranXperT. So once you get into DranXperT, it's a very easy to use user interface. You just merely open up a web browser, enter the IP address of DranXperT, which you can see up in my Mozilla web browser, and then you'll come up with a login page. Now we're past that at this point, but it'll ask you the username and the password of DranXperT. The default username is admin, A-D-M-I-N, and the default password as it comes from the factory is Dranetz with a capital D. D-R-A-N-E-T-Z. Once you click OK, and that's authenticated and accepted by the DranXperT meter, then you'll come to this kind of home page within DranXperT. And anytime during the DranXperT interface, you can see the information and status page. That's what we're talking about over here. It's the instrument status page, which acts as the DranXperT homepage. Well, just a little tour of the user interface. You have 4 different tabs to choose different functions within DranXperT. As we said, you have the information or the status or the home page. You have the setup tab, which has 4 selections: survey setup, instrument setup, uploading setup files, and downloading setup files from the instrument. And we'll cover these in the next few minutes. You have the data tab with meters, which are real-time meters, what the instrument's measuring right now, and it's updated every few seconds, and list files. What these are the files that have been previously recorded, or the file that's currently been recorded by the instrument. And this is where you copy data out of the instrument to your computer, what I was mentioning before. And then you have the factory tab. You probably won't spend much time in this, but this is where you update the firmware. Occasionally we do have firmware updates. If you get lost or the instrument is in trouble, this is where you would restore the instrument to its factory settings. If you need to restart the instrument for some reason, and also change its password from the Dranetz that I mentioned before. So just starting left and moving to right, we have this status tab. And what the status tab is basic information about your DranXperT. And it has things that maybe tech support will ask for, like the serial number, versions of the DranXperT. So when it comes time to update, you know what's presently in your instrument, so you can know whether you need a firmware update or not. And those firmware updates are always posted to our website, and they're a free download from our support / firmware update tabs. Or pages on the website. So there's other information like the site name that you've given DranXperT when you start and you enable a survey. This is the name that you assign to it in the setups over here in the setup tab. So this is your breaker panel, whatever service or site that you're monitoring at that time. The present status of monitoring. Monitoring is controlled in 2 ways. In an earlier section, we told you about the controls and indicators on DranXperT. In the front panel, there's a monitoring button. You press and hold that for 5 seconds to both turn on and then turn off monitoring. But you can do it in a soft way. On the home page or the instrument status page, there is a turn monitoring on button. And when monitoring's on, this changes to turn monitoring off. So you can always remotely control the monitoring status, but you can also press the button on the front panel of the instrument to control monitoring as well. So you have other things as well in this user interface on the home page, like what is your current active file that's being recorded to, and you can see parts of that are some internal information for us to locate it in our database, but you can see this is the file that you gave it. So this allows you to easily locate your files when you need to copy them out of the DranXperT. Give you information about the power source. This is being powered by the line. It'll say battery if there's no AC supply plugged into the instrument, or maybe you forgot to plug in your AC supply or there's some sort of problem. This will help you with that. In addition to that, it'll let you know whether the battery's charging and also the present level of the battery. This happens to be 100%, but if it's something other than that, it will certainly tell you that. You can see the IP address. You can see this happens to be the same IP address within our facility here. So this will tell you probably what you already need to know, or what you already know rather, because you've already connected to DranXperT. So you tend to know what the IP address is at that point. And then there's other information. There's the present time in the instrument. Just a note, DranXperT keeps time in UTC time, but there's settings within DranXperT to tell your local time zone. So your data and DranView can reference it in your local time zone. But this is just telling you what those times are really over here, what the local time is and what the UTC time is. And you can see they're two different times. Okay, and it's stored in the 24-hour time. The modules, this is just for internal use only. So again, in summary, the information in the status tab, this is the first thing that you will see. And at any time, go information and status when you're elsewhere in the user interface, and you can see this information. So going along, we have the setup tab. And again, there's two primary things here for the setup. There's the survey setup, which are details of your specific survey. And that's your monitoring setups, some database information, what the name of the setup is, your nominal voltages, your CTs, PTs, things like that. And then there's the instrument setup, which is some more generic information about the instrument. And we're going to look at those in detail right now. So if I click survey setup, you'll see what I mean. Over here, we're in the survey setup tab, and you can see some basic information about your survey, such as the survey name. You can enter and you can change this to anything that you'd like it to be. Okay. You have the nominal frequency here in the United States. We're measuring at 60 hertz, which is what the instrument defaults to. But certainly if you're in Europe or in Asia or other parts of the world, you can change that to 50 hertz. So these are the two selections there. Wiring configuration. This is kind of important, and this relates to the LED indicators that we spoke about earlier on the connection panel of DranXperT. So this is where you tell the meter what your wiring circuit is. Is it three-phase delta, three-phase Y, single phase, split phase? Just note that there are actually two delta connections here. And there's a 2-probe delta and a 3-probe delta. And really the only difference is whether you're connecting 3 CTs or 2 CTs to do the measurement. So all of the delta measurements by DranXperT are using the 2 CT, or kind of a Blondell 2-watt meter method. However, in this 3-probe method, you will also have the advantage of metering that third phase, or the line current on that third phase that wouldn't normally be needed on a 2-watt meter method. And for further information, just consult the quick reference guide of the instrument for a further explanation of that. So again, we have single phase, split phase, 3-phase Y, 3-phase delta 2-probe, and 3-phase delta 3-probe as your wiring configurations that you can choose. You can see we're set to 3-phase Y here. Enable monitor on power up. What monitoring is really what it should say on power up. And what this means is that when you're monitoring, if the instrument loses power for a long duration of time beyond the 7-hour battery limit, it's going to shut down. And now when power is restored, checking this box means that monitoring will be re-enabled when it restarts. If this box is not checked, monitoring will not be enabled when it restarts. So if you want your survey to continue, then make sure that this box is monitored. So if you should have a long duration power fail beyond the 7-hour battery, it will start automatically. Now, we mentioned previously that the pre-trigger cycles and the post-trigger cycles here. What that means is DranXperT is a recording device that can also do RMS variations. That's the basic PQ capabilities of DranXperT. So what this is a number of pre-cycles and the number of post-cycles that it will record if it detects an RMS type of event. And by RMS, we need the RMS voltage or current goes high or low from your nominal setting that you see below there. So that's pretty much a very simple sort of setting. So again, the pre-trigger, it's 10 and 60 here. You can have up to 600 cycles of data. And again, this is an RMS plot that you're going to see, a point-by-point RMS plot. The actual wave shapes are not recorded with this, but each AC cycle is going to be represented by one RMS point that's measured by DranXperT at that time. And you'll get a pre-trigger and a post-trigger around that particular fault event. So in the voltage area, you have several settings. You have the nominal. This is where you tell us the nominal setting. In this case, it's at 120, but elsewhere for other types of applications in the United States, you may see a 277 for a Y, 480 for a delta, and so forth. So that'll normally go with the type of wiring configuration that you have. So, and that's important because not only it tells the instrument what the nominal, but a couple lines below, you have the high threshold, the high threshold and the low threshold. So this is as a percent of this nominal. So what this means, the high threshold is 105% of this 120 volt nominal. And the low threshold is 90% of this 120 volt nominal. And those will change, of course, for your particular settings. So continuing along, we have the PT primary and secondary ratio. So DranXperT will connect up to a circuit or a voltage of 600 volts RMS directly. If you're measuring something beyond 600 volts RMS, then usually you're going to be connected to some sort of PT or a resistive divider. And at that point, there's usually going to be a scaling factor in a primary and secondary. And that's where you would enter it here. So you'd see in our example, we're actually measuring 120 volts directly off our panel directly to DranXperT. So there is no primary and secondary setting, but this is where you'd enter the primary of your PT, 13 kV, and this is where you would enter the secondary of your PT. Maybe that would be 120 volts. And so that'll give us the ratio. So DranXperT can multiply up your voltage as if it's measuring on the primary side of your circuit, okay? Which is not, again, it's measuring the secondary side. So sequence enable error detection. And what this basically is doing, it's looking for if you have a reverse power sequence or you make some errors on the wiring. And basically when you have that checked, those LEDs are going to blink on the front panel, as we said in the controls and indicators section. Enable voltage limits. So what that means is that if this is checked like it is, it's going to start looking for those high and low events based upon the settings. In this case, 105 volts on a high, or 105%, I should say, on a high limit of 120, and 90 volt low limit, 90% low limit, I'm sorry, reference to that 120 volts. So when they exceed those limits, high or low, it's going to start recording this 10-second pre-trigger, and I'm sorry, 10 cycle pre-trigger and this 60 cycle post-trigger. That will be recorded to memory. If this is not checked, enable voltage limits is not checked, well then it won't be checking for the voltage limits. The input order, this is where by default in most circuits are ABC in phase rotation. This is where you enter different phase sequencing or different phase rotation, but 99% of the applications will be in an ABC wiring order. And we certainly recommend that you wire in that way unless there's a reason not to, because your circuits are different. Now, excuse me, the current, it is kind of similar, but there's some extra settings that you need for the current settings or to enable current. So you have your nominal current, all right? This is the nominal current of your circuit. And again, like in voltage, this relates to those high and low limits. So this is gonna trigger on 150% high based upon this 600 amp limit. And this is 0 low. So it's not gonna really look at low limits for that. Then you have the probe type. There's many pre-selected probe types, and these directly align to the CTs that we sell directly and those CTs that are included in your packages. So going bottom up, we have 3 current ranges of our flex CTs. So there's a 500 amp flex CT, a 1500 amp flex CT, and a 3000 amp flex CT. And the XX is the length of the CT. So they're available in various lengths, 16, 24, and 36 inches, but the settings are exactly the same. So there's a 500 amp version of each length, a 1500 amp version of each length, and a 3000 amp version of each length. So you choose the appropriate one based upon what you're going to connect to the instrument. And the same thing over here, very similar to the hinged or the clip type CTs. And basically what that means, you have 5 different varieties. You just choose the one that's connected to the instrument. Just note that all 3 or 4 CTs have to be of the exact same type. And continuing along, you also have the custom type. And this basically means when you bring your own CT and connect it to DranXperT, you would choose the custom type. And at that point, you'd also need to give us the probe full scale so we can scale the probe correctly for you. And again, this is a time you bring your own CT. You do not want to use, or you do not have available, one of our CTs that we provide. Just note again, it needs to be a 333 millivolt output CT to be compatible with DranXperT. And none of the other DranXperT CTs or none of the DranXperT CTs from other product lines, such as DranXperT, are compatible, such as HDPQ, are compatible with DranXperT and vice versa. So continuing along, oftentimes you're going to be connected to a permanently installed CT, maybe a 10 amp metering CT, or certainly a permanently installed CT that you may already have there for other reasons. And this is where you enter the primary and the secondary ratios of that CT. So oftentimes you'll use a small CT, such as our 20 amp CT here, and you'll have a fixed installed CT. And again, this is with a 3000 amp primary side, but you're going to be measuring, or the DranXperT's going to be measuring that 5 amp secondary of that CT. Continuing along, you have the high limits as a percentage of this current nominal, and the low limit as a percentage of this current nominal. And if this box is checked, the enable current limits, I limits are checked, then the instrument's going to be looking at every cycle on a half cycle step, what comes in the instrument to trigger on that. And again, just like voltage, no wave shapes are recorded. An RMS point for each trigger, for each cycle that comes through, will be recorded. And this is in lockstep with the voltage. And basically it has the same pre and fault settings that we saw up above over here. All right, so the current and the voltage will both have the same number of cycles on the pre-trigger and on the post-trigger settings. Again, like in voltage on the current, you do have the sequence or the input order. We, of course, highly recommend that you make this the exact same thing as your voltage to make sure that they're lined up. And again, 99% of the applications will be in this ABC sequencing. Some other miscellaneous settings here in the energy area. This is if you want to set up a demand interval to be set. So you would check the enable box, and this is the standard, let's say 10-minute or 15 minutes as we see here, demand interval. You can also have a sub interval here, which is 5 minutes, okay? So this is a 15-minute demand interval with a 5-minute sub interval attached to it. Now this demand limit in the controls and indicators section, the PowerPoint that we looked at, we told you that there's a demand LED that's on the front panel of DranXperT. And this is where you set up the demand limit. So you would set this to maybe a demand limit in your utility bill. If you hit this demand limit, then you're going to go into another rate or pay a penalty or something like that. In DranXperT, you would enter this, and when you're monitoring, DranXperT would set that LED to notify you that you've exceeded the demand limit that you've set up for the instrument. The journal and the snapshot area. This works very similar to other instruments from DranXperT, a little bit different in its actual settings, but the concept is the same. So what this means is that the instrument is going to journal or trend parameters on a particular limit. Now, in parallel with that, it's also going to do the voltage and current high and low limits that we discussed earlier. So if this instrument is, or sorry, this box is checked, then the journal intervals in seconds, each 600 seconds in this particular example, or every 10 minutes in this example, you're going to record a journal interval or a journal record into the database. And what this means is that it's a textual snapshot of every measured parameter of DranXperT is going to be recorded in the database every 10 minutes. If you check this snapshot enable box, this also means one wave shape. This is the only time that DranXperT records wave shapes. A wave shape will be recorded at this particular interval over here. So I believe this is a 1 hour interval here, if I'm doing my math right. So every hour, you're going to get a wave shape recorded in the database, in addition to this textual data that's going to be logged and recorded in the database. So when you go review this information in DranView XP or any of the higher versions of DranView, you're going to see your trend in your journal points go along. And in parallel, maybe at a different time interval, you'll also see wave shape snapshots being recorded as well. And this is kind of powerful. It gives you a snapshot of the voltage, all voltage and all current channels at that particular time that this snapshot record was recorded in the database. And using DranView Pro and more appropriately DranView Enterprise, you can do additional math functions on that if you choose to do so. So that's the power of this. Now, when you're making any changes to here, you can click discard changes if you just want to throw them away, or submit changes, and that will accept them. And then when you enable monitoring, it'll start recording with those changes. Just note that if monitoring is enabled, you can review all your settings here, but you cannot change anything. So monitoring has to be turned off, again, either via the user interface here or in the front panel, for you to have the ability to modify any of these settings. So monitoring is on, they're view only here. So continuing along, again, we just showed you the survey setup. We're going to talk about the instrument setup. And this basically has general information about the instrument the instrument setup in general, not necessarily tied to your particular survey. So you can see here's the networking, and you can see we have a static IP address. This is how we're communicating with it. And you also have the ability for what's called DHCP. We talked about this in the connecting to DranXperT section. And if this box is checked and then you submit settings, DranXperT is going to go out on the network and try to get an IP address from the server. This is just the exact same way that every printer, every laptop, every Wi-Fi device, or not every, most of them connect to a network. The network assigns that device an IP address. However, those IP addresses can change. So if you connect your DranXperT, or quite frankly, your computer to the network today, tomorrow it can get another IP address. And that's important here. It's not as important for your computers and the printers, but for DranXperT, in order to communicate with it, as we're doing with the web browser, you do need to know this IP address, or it needs to be in a domain name service, which is a little more complicated. So by simply knowing its IP address, then you have the ability to easily enter that IP address and communicate with the DranXperT. So if this changes every time you turn on your DranXperT or it reboots, well, then you have to go find out what that IP address is, either from your IT people, or we have a utility to do that, which is beyond the scope of our meeting today. But these are things that you need to be able to do. So again, when you manually enter an IP address, you have the IP address, subnet, mask, or gateway. This is information that you'll get from your IT people. But also when you have DHCP enabled, all this stuff will be filled in for you. So now we have the date and time. And the date and time basically is what is the time that the instrument is set to? Are you going to have it adjust for daylight savings time? And what is your time zone? Okay, so in the United States here, we're on the Eastern time zone, so it's UTC -5 is what we've said here. And you just find your part of the world and you would make that setting. So the input channels, and this is where we mentioned before in the indicator section, you do have the ability to change the color of the LEDs on the front panel. It defaults to red, yellow, and blue, and you can change that to any other color that's within this palette over here, possibly to match whatever color or wiring that you have in your system, and this will change the color of the LEDs on the front panel. So we have the database setting here, and basically what this means is the max dB file in seconds. Basically what that means is how long will the instrument record, the meter record, before it starts another file. And this does default to 31 days, which happens to be the custom setting. I know this is a little confusing here because this is in seconds. And the reason why we defaulted to 31 days is that's a month. That's the worst case in a month. So it'll record for 31 days by default. And when you exceed 31 days, it's going to close out this present file and just restart another file. And you can take that into DranView and look at the files independently, or DranView Pro and Enterprise will stitch them together for you. If you want your own custom size, you can change 1 hour up to 1 year of continuous recording of your data with your DranXperT files. Okay, so this is the how long the meter will record until it closes the file and restarts again. Again, if you stop monitoring it or stop the monitoring in the middle, fine, that is the duration of your file. So this is unattended monitoring that we're talking about. Now, the max DB keep minutes. This is kind of an internal database maintenance. And what that means is that it's going to keep your data in memory by default for 3 months here. So after 3 months, if the memory fills, it's going to start deleting the oldest data in memory. So after 2 years for this setting, all the way to 1 day, if your data is older than that in the database, it's going to have the ability to erase that data. And really that's a fail-safe to prevent the instrument from filling inadvertently if you're not good at maintaining your data and deleting your older surveys. They tend to kind of queue up just like anything on your computer. Sometimes you need to do maintenance on that. So some other miscellaneous settings here, if you happen to be running the BACnet or the Modbus protocols, this is used for kind of a semi-permanent or permanent installation of DranXperT. You have the ability to enable each one of them, and you can see BACnet is not enabled. You would just simply click that enable and give it the BACnet device ID. And similarly for Modbus, this happens to be enabled. This DranXperT is part of our DranSCADA demonstration that we have online, and it basically responds to the default Modbus port of 502. All right, and just to wrap things up, anytime you are done with your settings, you would click Submit Change. This is not lit up because we didn't make any changes. As an example, let me just disable something. And you can see Submit Changes does light up here. So you can just click Discard if you want to ignore those changes, or click Submit Changes and it will save them. So the next time that you start monitoring, it'll record based upon whatever changes that you did make here. So I'm going to just click Discard Changes. So there's 2 other options under the setup menu here. I'm not going to go into them in great detail, but you do have the option to download a setup file. And any file that's recorded by DranXperT, whether it be a data file or a setup file, has this JSON extension to it. So there are configuration files that it can save off automatically. Let's say that you realize that you have a particular setup for the meter that you commonly use for a particular type of circuit, maybe a particular type of customer. So instead of re-enabling these or setting these things up manually every time, you can save off a setup, and that setup will represent a template of what your settings are. And then when you go back to that type of customer circuit, you can just go upload setup file, and then it will upload that to memory, and then you can just start monitoring, maybe by just changing the survey name in your file, which may be unique to that particular customer or panel. And then you can just go to the information tab and status at any time, and then just go turn on monitoring. Okay, so that's just an example of the use of the upload and the download setups. So continuing along, we have the data menu. The data menu has 2 items in it. The meters and the list files. Going bottom up, the list files, we'll talk about that in a minute. These are the files, the data files that are recorded by the meter. And the meters is simply what's going on right now. What are the real-time meters of the instrument? So this is extremely powerful. And we always recommend you have a look at this after you set up your instrument, just to make sure the real-time meters look appropriate. All the scaling is there. As an example, looking at the current maybe to make sure that your current seems to be measured right based upon the types of CTs that you've configured DranXperT. So make sure that scaling's right. The same for voltage, the same for anything. It kind of gives you a sanity check to make sure that the meter is operating correctly. And again, we recommend you do that before you enable monitoring. Well, just as a regular check before, during, and after monitoring, you always have the ability to look at the real-time meters. Okay, so this will update every few seconds, and there's several sections. You have an energy section, a power section. Scrolling down, you have the neutral section and the demand section, and those are kind of a little self-descriptive here. So the energy, you're getting an idea what the watt hours are, the megawatt hours, the kilowatt hours, depending upon the scaling that you've achieved or the amount of energy consumed. And basically that's available on a single phase basis as well as a total. So some things have totals here, Some things don't have totals. It depends upon the type of parameter, whether the total is going to apply. And we'll give you some examples of that. So here's your energy, both reactive, true, reactive, and apparent. And basically the same thing at only the fundamental. So not including the harmonics. This is the 50 or 60 hertz components of energy. Scrolling down, we have power parameters. Excuse me. And this is where the general kind of power stuff is. The frequency, the voltage, the current, true power factor, apparent power factor, reactive power factor, or I'm sorry, power rather, true power, apparent power, reactive power, and then we go into the power factors over here, THDs and so forth. And you can see some of these are applicable for a total, like frequency is an individual phase measurement, but there's no total frequency. There's really no standard out there industry practice to give total frequency. Same thing for voltage, same thing for current, but total power, of course, we need to look at total power just like we need to look at total energy. So you can scroll top down. Again, we have voltage and current THDs. DranXperT does not provide individual harmonics, but it provides THD on each measured phase. And then you have a lot of these things, but just at the fundamental. And you have 1 second average information and 200 millisecond average information. We mentioned in one of the early web presentations on DranXperT that it does follow this very similar measurement techniques in the more advanced meters, such as those techniques in IEC 61000-4-30. It's not compliant. We're not certifying or claim compliance, but that's where some of these measurements come from. And last but not least, you have the voltage phase. This is the phase angle of each voltage and each current as you have wired it and as your system is presenting to the meter. So the neutral information that is broken out in a separate area here. So you can see what's going on in the neutral. Again, the neutral RMS current, it's 1 second average information and is 200 millisecond information as well. And last but not least, you have the demand information. So peak demands, reactive, apparent demand, and also that information at the fundamental. So again, the data and the meter tab or selection is real-time information about what DranXperT is metering right now. So if I go to data and list files, these are showing me and you the files that have been recorded by DranXperT. So we are not recording right now. If you were recording, this first one listed will kind of be shaded out here. Why that's that way? Because you can't copy it out, you can't modify it, you can't delete it because the meter is actively recording to that file. Everything that's bold here or is not shaded out can be copied out of the instrument or it can be deleted. So again, if you're recording, you will not have the ability to do anything to the present file that's being recorded. You would have to stop recording and then copy that out. Now, how do we do that? It's really not that not that difficult, but what you see here, and again, bear with us that this is a demonstration instrument, so there happens to be a lot of data, but these are all the individual files recorded by DranXperT. I should note that a lot of our testing is done on a daily basis. It just helps us evaluate the meter a little bit more easily when we're doing testing. So this is a test meter. So you'll see a lot of small data files. But again, as I mentioned before, you would typically, and by default, a data file is 31 days in length. And if you go beyond 31 days, it'll close out the file and reopen a new file and just have continuous monitoring there. So how do you manage these files? You scroll down to the bottom. And you can see how you have several choices. And the primary actions that you're going to do is to download the data and delete the data files if you choose to do so. And basically anything that you checked here, I'm just randomly checking files here, you can zip and download to your computer for not only to archive them and save them, but to open them by DranView, or you can delete these files. So this is how you, again, get data out, and this is how you manage the database and delete data. So as an example, maybe I just pulled my DranXperT off the shelf. I'm ready to do a brand new survey. I want to check all of these things, possibly delete all the older data if I don't need that. So that way I'll have all the available memory within DranXperT for my new survey that I'm going to do. After that, I'd go to the setup tab over here, tabs, and then go configure it and start monitoring for my new application. However, if you've just completed a monitoring, and I'm going to uncheck these. Well, then you want to download that to the computer to go look at the results. So maybe this last file over here, you can see it was recorded on July 12th, just as a hypothetical example. I would check this and or any other files that I wanted to download, scroll to the bottom, click zip and download the selected data file. So what this is going to do, and I'm going to click it, it's going to zip the files. Zipping, if you're unaware, that's a compression technique. That's to make the files smaller so they'll be quicker to upload to your computer, or using this terminology, download to your computer. It also puts them in one file. So if I have multiple files checked here, I'm going to download one file to the computer, and then Windows has the ability to quickly unzip them. And what that means, if I've checked 5 files, I take them to my computer, and we'll see that process in a second. Then when I unzip them, I'm going to have 5 files on my computer. So I zip up 5, I transfer 1, and then I unzip to have 5 individual files on my computer in that hypothetical example. So you can see it was very quickly done. It's going to be creating a name called DranXperT-copy.zip. And it'll say save file here by default. So this is like an FTP site, if you've ever used that to transfer data, and usually that's large data. So I'm going to click OK. Now it's going to ask me where I want to put that on my computer. So no matter where my DranXperT is, it can be right next to me on the table, it can be on the other side of my building, across in another country. It's going to be this exact same process, because the network is going to bring that data to you. So it's going to ask you where you want to put it on your computer. I have a seminar folder here that I have as an example, and you can see I've done this before. So the file exists. So if I click save, it's going to ask me if I want to overwrite that file. I'm going to say yes here, but if you do not have data there, you did not do this prior, it'll just save the file off and you will not get this prompt. So I'm going to say overwrite, and now it's on my computer. Okay. To unzip the files, you merely go to where the data has been recorded. I'm going to just drag over my Windows File Explorer, because I have a couple monitors here, and you can see this is on my computer. You can see I have DranXperT data copied, which is what I just put over. And this happens to be an older version of that I've done. So if I right click on DranXperT data copied, you can see built into Windows has the extract function. So if I say extract all, it's going to unzip that data. All right, I have another window that popped up. Let me drag that over. Now this is Windows asking you where you would like to put that data. And this is the path. You can see it's on my computer, seminar DranXperT data copy. That's the file that I want to create. It's already there, so I'm going to overwrite it. So I'm going to say extract. And basically it overwrote that, and these are the files that we checked, or this is the one file that I checked to download on this particular test or demonstration that I've done. So you would simply go to DranView, any version of DranView, File, Open, and go to this particular path or this particular folder, and you would upload or open any particular file that you were interested in. So it's really that easy. All right, so we talked about information, setup, data. Now we're going to go to the factory menu. You're not going to spend much time in this menu, but this is where you do a little maintenance of the instrument if you need to do so. One of the basic things, you may want to change the password. So again, the default password is Dranix with a capital D, but maybe you want to change that just to protect the instrument a little bit. When you do that, the username remains as admin, but the password is modifiable or changeable by you. Just remember that when you go past the default, we can't help you tech support wise if you do change it to something that you forget. Okay, other than that, the instrument has to be reset to recapture that. So there's update firmware. This is again when we have an update, we've corrected some bugs, made some enhancements for you. These will be posted on our website. You simply follow a simple procedure, and in effect, what you do is you download that firmware update from your website, from our website rather. Using this procedure, you transfer the firmware update to the instrument, and then using this procedure, you instruct the instrument to install that latest version of firmware. Conceptually, it's a very simple process. Then you have several get out of jail sort of things here. So if you forget your DranXperT settings, you get lost, or the meter isn't working properly, you suspect something, well, you can basically reset the meter to as it leaves the factory. And there's three options here, and that's to protect you and your ability to not only communicate with the instrument, but also to keep the data that has been recorded and only reset the settings. So this first one, restore factory defaults, but keep the IP address. This is important. This is going to reset all the settings, but the IP settings, the communication settings will not change. That's so you can continue to communicate with the product. If you reset the IP address, well, then you lose communications with it after the instrument restarts. The next one here is the restore to factory defaults, but purge the data as well. So it's going to wipe out the settings, reset the settings, wipe out and erase all the data, but it will keep the IP address. That's, again, is very important. You need to keep your communications established with the meter. And the last one here is what we do, quite honestly, before we ship an instrument to you, brand new out of the line or off the line. This resets everything, including the IP address and all the communication settings. So at this point, it'll reboot. It's no settings or no nothing that's not a factory default, including the IP address. And also the last one here, should you choose to restart the meter, you have the ability to do that remotely. For some reason you suspect something, you can tell it to go restart right away.